Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes because a few more people should be arriving shortly, maybe another 3 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the wait. We're about to begin right now. My name is Bradley Watson, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And I could tell you that I'm an environmental scientist or a sustainable development specialist or any other thing, but today I am the Youth Climate Ambassador, and I'm here on behalf of the young people of the Bahamas and the young people of the Caribbean and even the young people of the world, because we have to be here to stand in solidarity and present this argument so that we can have a voice in the fight against climate change. Climate change isn't just bleached coral, it's not just melting ice caps. Climate change is every problem that we face as we try to cope with a world that's changing beneath our feet. It's mothers who are trying to feed hungry children, but they don't see a way to do so. It's young people who let their dreams die as they try to find a way to live in the world that was given to them. Climate change is LGBTQ+ people who are sacrificing and losing the safe spaces they've created in order to find a future for themselves outside of their home communities. Climate change is fathers who can't sleep at night because they have families at home that they don't know how to provide for. This is what climate change is for us, and it's real for us today, right now, right here at COP27. And there are a lot of problems with COP. People talk about COP as a meet and greet for people to talk about climate change, but they don't do anything. Corporations send delegations of consultants on private jets to negotiate solutions, or more importantly, to mitigate climate change through for-profit endeavors that really don't serve our purposes, don't help us to live in the realities we face. Governments develop pavilions that, show all of the ostentatious luxuries that are actually causing these problems, instead of committing to accounting for their actions in the past by compensating for loss and damages caused by global climate change. But at the same time, those very individuals are our brothers and sisters, and they're the only ones who can help us create a future that we can share. And so we're here today in solidarity to find a way to negotiate the way forward. I'm here from the Bahamas, a country that was ravaged by Hurricane Dorian, where refugees were turned into refugees, day by day trying to find a new place to live and a new way to secure a future for themselves. We all came in, and our government was kind enough to bring in 5 young people to figure out what is the next step, to develop a way, an army even, to fight for the future. And so right now we're going to talk about all of the ways we can adapt to global climate change and the steps that our government is about to take in collaboration with the young people of our country and nonprofit organizations that are here to help us along the way. So I want to introduce first Special Advisor Jerome Fitzgerald, Senior Policy Advisor for the Government of the Bahamas, who is here representing his administration. He was a previous Minister of Education, and so he's in touch with the youth of our country. He's here to move forward our agenda of climate mitigation and also, more importantly, climate change adaptation. We have Ms. Marcia Musgrove, a former teacher, former environmental educator, and now director of the Northern Bahamas program of the Nature Conservancy. And she is here to elaborate on the efforts that nonprofit organizations are making to advance the goals of climate change adaptation in our country. And lastly, we have Ashanti Russell, who is a youth climate representative, here to represent the young people on this panel, but also to represent herself as a staunch supporter of the fight for climate change, taking every effort, every opportunity to make these changes real. I want to begin our panel with a question for Minister Fitzgerald. For most of the 20th century, the Bahamas typically experienced 2 to 3 significant storms or hurricanes every decade. But we have been hit by 8 powerful storms in the last decade. Even now, while we're at COP27, the same islands ravaged by Dorian are taking another hit from Tropical Storm Nicole. And this is even outside of our typical hurricane season. How have these frequent intense storms affected our islands and economy? And how have we responded? And how can we typically finance that response?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I want to make the point that I think I may be the eldest one on the panel. So I can recall that my youth is totally different to what the young people are experiencing today. I could only remember one hurricane in my lifetime before I turned 18. My children grew up in a totally different world where they were born essentially into hurricanes. And a hurricane to them is not something that is out of the ordinary. But it does impact us in a different kind of way as well because of, as I said, the fact that I could remember back a number of years. I can actually see the difference between where the sea levels were when I was growing up on the beaches and along the shoreline, and I can see where the seawater has risen and how it's impacting every time I now drive along the coastline. I become fearful, and I wonder what the future what the future will be like for not only my children, but the people of the Bahamas as a whole. And so it's a daunting and scary experience. And the challenge, of course, is there's a lot of talk, as you said, but those of us who are on the front line see it every day. You talk about the economics, and I'll touch on the economics of it, but there's also the mental health side of it that's really becoming a factor. We're now, as you said, experiencing Nicole, which essentially took the same path or similar path to Dorian. Dorian, in and of itself, was the most powerful storm we had experienced in our generation, and the damage there to our GDP was $3.4 billion. Essentially, 25% of our GDP was impacted with one storm. And it's traumatic. It's really a traumatic experience. And those, when Nicole started to turn in towards the Bahamas, there was a level of anxiety and fear that's hard to relate to and calculate, except if you've been in it and you've experienced it. There was loss of life, there was loss of property, there was displacement of families and people. And so every time we come into this season, there is a lot of concern. The next point is that this is a hurricane that formed while it was over the Bahamas, and so now it's Hurricane Nicole, and it happened in November, which is very late for us in the hurricane season. Normally we breathe a sigh of relief once we get into October, because we think, although we know this hurricane season goes to November, it's highly unlikely that we have hurricanes past September. And so that's another factor now where the hurricanes we're finding are being pushed back further and further into the year. And we've already had 3 cold fronts before the hurricane, which is unusual. On the financing side, the way the government is set up, as most governments are, we have what we call our recurrent expenditure, which is what fuels the government, which pays all the bills, pays all the salaries. And then we have our capital expenditure, which we use to fund capital works, clinics, hospitals, schools, and so forth. But we don't have any provisions to plan for hurricanes. There's no financial provision, there's no money set aside, because all of the money that's generated is essentially made to pay the government's expenses. And so whenever we do have one of these major hurricanes, or any type of tropical storm even that has a lot of flooding, the government is left to have to borrow funds in order to meet the obligations and to help its citizens out. And so that's a serious concern for us.
Thank you very much, Advisor Fitzgerald. I want to move on to a question for Ms. Musgrove. Pardon me, for Ashanti. Everything in life is relative, and the impacts of climate change are measured by comparison with the situations that existed beforehand. But you, as a young person, were born into this situation, and you don't have any previous knowledge to compare it to. What has been your experience as a young person imagining your future in a country at the front lines of climate change impacts?
Thank you so much for the question. You are correct in saying I am really not old enough to say surely that I have witnessed the drastic change in climate. For as long as I've been alive, the world has been pretty consistent in its heating and its warming. But in terms of what I imagine in a world for me growing up, particularly in the Bahamas, really is based around the entire concept of collaboration and actually stabilizing things as best as we can. And the reason I say that is because I grew up hearing stories. Basically, all I can refer to is at one point the Bahamas was, I won't say stable, but far better than it is today. We had a more comprehensive climate. There wasn't such blistering summers, and as far as hurricanes go, I've heard about the 1938 hurricane, the 1932 Katrina, and Hurricane Andrew. But every year we are battered with something else. We've danced from Irma, Matthew, Joaquin, Dorian, and now Nicole. And it's honestly traumatizing when you think about it, that this has become the consistent pattern that I'm going to have to probably experience for, I'm hoping not the rest of my life, but it's going to be pretty consistent if we don't change things now while we can. As far as what I imagine for our country going forth in terms of the current climatic situation, I would like to see more involvement with reference to the youth in this space. And the reason I say that is because we are really and truly the forefront and are going to be the storytellers of this issue. We are going to be the ones that, unfortunately, when the sands of time continue to pass on, will be present for the stories. We will be present for the environmental shifts. We will be present for everything that occurs. And to think about that as a mantle in itself is, for lack of another word, frightening. And the reason I refer back to saying that youth need to play a more dynamic role majorly is because this is not just a Bahamas-centric issue. This is not a regional issue. This is a global phenomenon. And if we don't start thinking more internationally as youth, I don't want to say we will be left behind, but we will be severely handicapped. The world is going to continue moving forward regardless of how prepared we are. The hurricanes that have been occurring are a testament to that. And that is one of the reasons why I am very fervently in tune with the concept of youth playing a more dynamic role in this space, because we need to learn as much as we can, while we can, from individuals like the ones on the side of me that have been in the field for a substantial amount of years, if you don't mind me saying. But we're going to need that insight at this point, because if we lean on to our own understanding, it will not be enough.
Thanks so much for that answer. What do you think is the difference between your life and your parents' life, and how do you present these arguments to them, and what do you need from them in order for them to support you?
With reference to what I feel can continue to be provided from the generation before ours, speaking from a personal experience, one of the issues I've encountered is the whole environmental track as a profession. In my family, we are more, I'd say, dedicated to a different path. And once I indicated this is the parameters to which I wanted to operate, there was the concern that though the world is changing, me dedicating my career path to the events that can occur, will occur, might occur, is a bit, the word they decided to use was dramatic. I feel as though, given the situation, we need more dramatic approaches. We need more tentative and demanding actions. And with reference to comparing it to that of my predecessors, I'll use, it is totally different. When I have conversations with them, particularly because one of my grandfathers was an avid fisherman, and in hearing his stories about the drastic shifts in the reef structures him having to go further out to actually get the same amount of quota that he would have gotten, let's say, 5 years prior to, it's been drastically different. In doing seagrass bed measurements as well as zoning, there is a dramatic shift. In some areas that were more populated, let's say 2-3 years ago, it's different. The layout is changing. The waters are gradually heating. And to say that in relating this to the individuals that are older than I am, they point out the drastic difference that the world I am going to grow up in is going to be drastically different from the one that they would have had the pleasure to. We're going to have to fight a little harder. We're going to have to advocate a little more. And in having a system that was a bit combative in the beginning, it gave me the platform, it gave me the opportunity. I don't want to say practice, but for a lack of a better word, that's what it allowed me the fortune of. I got to lobby and to relay to them why it is I'm so passionate about this particular issue, why it is I'm so tentative about it, and what I hope to see in the future.
Thank you so much. It's important that we hear your voice in this room and we think about how the interactions between generations are important to moving this thing forward. I want to now give Ms. Musgrove a chance to lean in on the debate, and she represents an organization that conserves nature for mankind. Our people and infrastructure don't suffer alone from the impacts, our people don't suffer alone from the impacts of climate change. The natural environment is also under assault. What are some of the impacts that we should be concerned about when we think about global climate change?
Thank you, Bradley, for the question, and it's a good segue from what Ashante just mentioned about changes, noticing changes in the environment and having the older generation be able to help us understand what those shifting baselines are looking like. And so we know what happens. So for us in the Bahamas, of course, hurricanes are front and center. That's one of the most dramatic, rapid climate events that we experience, and the panel has shared has become more recurrent. And so it's top of mind for us, but it's not the only impact. Nevertheless, so between the high winds, the flooding, the salt intrusion that changes the landscape in terms of soil pH, we have other conditions like the sea level rise that was mentioned, changes in rainfall patterns that contributes to drought, coastal erosion. All of these things are shifting what our ecosystems look like. And so, for example, when we had Dorian pass through and the Nature Conservancy supported an assessment of forests on Grand Bahama, the forestry unit, with the forestry unit, we noticed that there was significant damage and die-off of pine forest ecosystems that had been standing for decades, 60-70% die-off in those areas. And I had the chance to go back there just about 2 months ago, and driving down the street and looking at hundreds of acres of just dead sticks standing in the air, and the brown from the mangroves that had been just not growing back, not recovering as well as we would normally expect. It felt like I was driving through a scene in a movie, like some kind of horror movie where you're headed into a desert. And these ecosystems, the pine forests, the mangrove forests, the coral reefs, the seagrasses are very important, not just for the sake of nature, but because of all of the ecosystem services and benefits they provide for us as a people. Giving an example, the pine forest ecosystem is somewhere where there's a lot of a tree called tatch palm, and the older ladies and the younger generation learning to plait the straw, stripping the leaves, plaiting those straw, and that's a whole straw craft industry that is a part of our tourism industry, and a lot of women make their living through that pathway. We have the traditional cultural things like what I grew up with, going into the pine forest and getting, some of y'all will know the name of these bush I'm calling, strong bark, love vine, gamalame, sweet Margaret, etc. This is what we grew up with, making teas and medicines, and that's part of our cultural heritage. Then we also note that in the mangrove ecosystems, these are nursery areas for the conch, the spiny lobster, the snappers and grunts that are key commercial species for our fisheries. They move from the mangroves and the seagrass areas and head out onto the reef. And so when we have climate events that are rapid, like storms, that just completely devastate miles and miles as far as you can see of areas, that has a significant cultural impact, recreational impact, and commercial impact on the communities and the people who live directly in those places, but also the rest of us who are in the Bahamas who are depending on what they supply to us as well. And so with respect to environmental impacts, there's the rapid, but there's also slow onset. So as the oceans are warming, they're absorbing more greenhouse gases. Okay, sounds great, the oceans are a carbon sink. But a part of that, the ripple effect, is that it also makes the ocean more acidic. And what does that do? It causes a dissolution of the limestone that makes up the coral reef structure, of the shells of those same animals that are some of our main exports or commercial products. And so the environment takes a hit, and when the environment takes a hit, there's a ripple effect into all of these other areas. Tourism, ecotourism, part of our bread and butter, right? The Nature Conservancy did a study with JetBlue where I think we identified about $575 million in coral-related tourism values that come from just things associated with that one ecosystem. And so it's important for us to pay attention to what's happening in the natural environment, because there's the ripple effect and it comes back to us as people, socially, culturally, recreationally, etc.
Wow, thank you for that. And as an environmentalist who observed the extinction of a native Bahamian bird on Grand Bahama from one hurricane, you know, what you're saying to me, it rings so true. And I want to ask you, how can we harness nature to protect ourselves from the impacts of climate change? What are these nature-based solutions we talk about?
Yeah, so of course, there are many different needs with respect to adaptation, and when we talk about climate change. With the Nature Conservancy, one of the lens that we look through is through nature-based solutions. So what are nature-based solutions? We're talking about actions that conserve, restore, sustainably use, and effectively manage natural ecosystems that provide all of these services. But there are a couple of other components for it to be a nature-based solution as well. And one of those is that it has to have social and economic benefit, the activity, but also that it has to help human well-being. So it's just not nature alone, but ensuring that all of those other values that nature brings are part, parcel, and package of whatever the action is when we say nature-based solutions. So a few examples of nature-based solutions for us would be, for example, setting up marine protected areas where we conserve important nursery areas that seed other areas around the ocean. It could be replanting of mangroves, coupled with a seawall, so there's pure nature solutions. Then there's what we call the like blended or green-gray, where you're using nature along with traditional hard infrastructure, so on various types of modifications. So this is the approach that the Nature Conservancy takes, and we work in collaboration with the government, with other NGO partners, with local communities to design these solutions that are a win-win for nature and for people.
A win-win solution, looking at synergies, that's the only way I think we could do it. So I want to now move on to speaking with Advisor Fitzgerald and asking about the NDCs that we just submitted. And I understand that we're working on a national adaptation plan as well. What are some of the country's commitments with respect to climate change mitigation? And what are our main adaptation priorities?
Thank you. I want to say, first of all, that the department that deals with this area within the government falls under the Department of Environmental Planning and Protection. And that is headed by Dr. Rihanna Neely and her team. And they have been very, I want to say, not necessarily aggressive, but they've been very forward-thinking and attempting to coordinate it with what some of the projects are and the direction that the government is going. You would have heard throughout this, throughout COP this year and before, that carbon credits is really emerging as a new asset class. The Bahamas has what we consider now the largest seagrass bed or meadows in the world. And having the nationally determined or NDCs fit into that helps to form what we're looking at as far as our baseline and so forth are concerned. So the work they're doing is critical for us. They're looking to have a reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions by some 30%, 20% conservation of our national forests, and 35% electrical vehicles introduced by 2030. So these are some aggressive positions that have been taken. Most of the world has taken the same position with regard to the Paris Accord, but needless to say, they are not, they have their own challenges. I was making the comment earlier just with electric cars. It took us almost a year for us to get 50 electric government cars, all right? And so you're moving towards these goals that are set, but then you're looking at the supply and availability of them. And then you're talking also about infrastructure that's needed for these electric cars. It's not just an electric car. You know, you have to have the stations in which to plug in. Those are expensive as well. And so, again, making this transition, you go back to the budget and what's required. These are not things that are planned for during the course of your normal budget. Also, with regard to adaptation priorities, improving the planning, preparation, and response to climate emergencies, strengthen the national framework to receive adaptation funds, increase climate resilience across the health sectors, improve management and conservation of our critical ecosystems, improve early warning systems. But the resilience across health, infrastructure, and agriculture and education is also critical as well. So the various policies and programs that are in draft and have been implemented to reduce taxes on certain areas where we think are important in order to assist with these plans that we have.
I was also really excited to hear about the work you're doing towards making infrastructure from the brine, from the salt, from the reverse osmosis plants that you were talking about with Ambassador Fox, and the fact that that also sequesters carbon. So that's another way that you guys are working on climate change, sequestering carbon, and that's generating carbon credits, but also creating infrastructure to protect the vulnerable communities of the Bahamas. And I wanted to add on to that question, how much funding do we have, or how much do we need to get this work done?
I'm advised from the work that's been done for the NDCs that we're probably going to require about $4 billion in order for us to fully implement all of the plans and proposals and strategies that are included in there. Again, when you ask Dr. Neely and those at DEP what the challenges are, they will tell you up front, funding. Funding is a major challenge. But again, these are things that we need to survive. We have to have this plan in place. We have to submit it. We have to put forth what our plans are for the implementation of it. And we have to now find ways in which to fund it. And so it goes back to this position that the Prime Minister has continued to talk about, that we're on the front line of this for a problem and challenge that we didn't create. But yet still, we are asked to bear the brunt of the burden, to fund, to make us more resilient, to have the proper adaptation plans in place, and to mitigate where we can. But again, it's not part of our regular budgetary funding mechanisms. And so we have to go out and beg for funding through those organizations that are set up to help. And when that's exhausted, we are forced to borrow. And it's a very challenging position to be in, where those who are really the cause of the predicament we find ourselves in are also the ones who have our debt. And they hold our debt. And then when we experience this, we have to go back to them and borrow for something that they caused. And so it's really a heck of a position to be in. I equate it to having a home and an arsonist who holds a mortgage on your home burns your house down. And when you go outside, the arsonist is there to lend you money to build your house back. But he's the cause of your house burning down in the first place, and he holds a mortgage on it, and so you have to borrow again to build your house. And so it's really a difficult position that we find ourselves in, and it's disheartening sometimes, because we're a small island country, island nation like most SIDS, and it's at least we're coming together now so our voices can be heard as one, but trying to get the larger countries to listen is proving difficult. And I think the Prime Minister has now shifted the argument really to ask these countries to look at their own self-interest and have an enlightened self-interest with regard to that. So that's the position. But $4 billion is what it's going to cost for us to implement INDCs.
$4 billion, that's a whole lot of money. And I did some research, and it was saying that the Bahamas has not held its own insurance. We've always been underwritten by external insurers since 1992 after Hurricane Andrew. And so, we are funding other nations and their corporations, and so we're asking for help to do so. And luckily enough, we have an organization like TNC that steps in and provides this almost like an angel investment for nature, coming in and helping to facilitate change. So we want to know, what does TNC do in the Bahamas to support national priorities, including conservation or even climate finance?
All right, so one of the things that I understand as a TNC employee, but also as a Bahamian, is that the climate adaptation needs of the country have to be attacked through multiple avenues, and NGOs, private sector, the corporate sector, communities, governments, we have to strengthen our collaboration in order to get this work done. It literally takes a village. We're not going to be able to do it on our own. No one entity has all of the funding or the expertise. So for over 20 years, the Nature Conservancy's local program in the Bahamas has been supporting the national priorities with respect to environmental conservation and management, but also more recently having a specific focus on climate change adaptation and on also supporting the country's mitigation endeavors. And we do this through a number of ways broadly. We lend technical assistance and support to the relevant government agencies. So whatever the national policies and agenda are that they're trying to implement, we come alongside and see how that aligns with what we do, and we offer technical support. We also offer training and capacity building. So We sponsor a lot of training workshops, support government agencies and non-government partners, communities with gaining skills so that they can execute the work that they do. We provide physical resources, so we don't give funding directly to governments, but we give in-kind. So we give physical resources, I mentioned, the technical support and capacity building. That has a dollar value on it. We share a lot of data as well, and we do give grant funding. And when we add to NGOs and local community groups as well, and when we add all that up, for the past 20 years, TNC has invested tens of millions of dollars into the Bahamas and advancing our agenda. But I want to acknowledge, though, that our local Bahamas team on the ground, we can't do that alone. We have the privilege of being supported by regional staff, by a global team, and this is one of the things I actually like about working for an international organization at home, because I'm able not only to bring expertise locally, but whatever we need to advance work in the country, we can call on expertise from anywhere in the world where it exists and get them to come and help us. And of course, the Nature Conservancy, as a nonprofit, we have many donors that make the work that we do possible, and so they trust us to deliver, and we're grateful for that. Many partners, conservation partners, et cetera, that we work with, and community stakeholders, so we all get this work done together. One of the things that I also want to mention too, and reiterate, is how important it is for NGOs like us and any other NGOs or corporate partners who are ready to come alongside, is to make sure that our work is mapped on national priorities. So we're not out here just doing something that we think is good for the Bahamas, but we are doing what we are asked to support, or what we see in the agendas of the country that is a priority, and we try our best to push that agenda forward. How do we do this? We listen, and we act. And that's important to me personally as well. Across the work that we do, we have about 4 main strategies, and 3 of them really directly align with the priorities in the NDC from a climate change perspective. So we work on marine protected areas that help to conserve those key ecosystems that are carbon sinks, but that also help with flood risk reduction, coral reefs and mangroves that are like frontline ecosystems. We also work on sustainable fisheries, and there are climate change activities that are weaved into that work. We work on coral conservation and restoration, and we also have a specific climate adaptation strategy. And TNC does a lot of work that benefits the environment more broadly, but I'm going to give a few examples here of projects that we're working on that specifically support the NDC, the National Adaptation Policy that was created. So it falls under categories of science, data, philanthropic funding, and then sustainable finance mechanisms. So the Nature Conservancy actually has the largest conservation data set in the region. And information is really important for policymakers, decision makers, to be able to decide where to invest time, energy, effort, and funding. And so through those conservation data sets, we're able to do things like do ecological gap analyses, et cetera, supporting the Department of Meteorology with information that helps them with their flood risk modeling, et cetera. We also have recently completed the most updated, if you will, benthic habitat maps for the insular Caribbean, including the Bahamas. That's at a 4M resolution, which so far would be the highest resolution of maps to date. Most of the global maps that shine a light on the Bahamas that are like a 30M resolution. And so that is data that's going to be used to help with making decisions around coastal zone management and where we should deploy restoration activities, et cetera. Also, after Hurricane Dorian, we gave direct support to partners in Grand Bahama and Abaco to help them restore their operations, including a community of fishers that we work with who had lost their boats, lost all of their equipment and everything. And so to help them get back to work, we helped to restore some of their equipment and offered some more training around climate smart fisheries. And then more specifically, when we talk about the finance space, so in addition to the direct philanthropic funding through grants that I mentioned that we give, we have a few key projects. One is the Bahama Reefs Project, which is one of our newest projects, and this is actually an impact investing project. So the Nature Conservancy is a convening agency for the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, and we have a grant of about up to $10 million that we're going to be able to access over a 6 to 8 year period, and that is going to support what we call reef positive businesses. And so that there's a pipeline of businesses that will be able to access that funding, but there are certain criteria for who can access it, and it simply has to be some kind of business model that is going to be good for the reef, for the coral reef. So an example would be the Elizabeth Harbor Partnership. This is a group Elizabeth Harbor is a huge harbor that has lots of boats and yachts that comes in at varying times of year. And all of those boats have waste that needs to be disposed of. Unfortunately, there isn't a pump out station for those boats. So the Elizabeth Harbor Partnership will be getting funding so that they can purchase a pump out boat that will be able to offer a service to all of these yachters and boaters. And that is going to help with pollution control in that environment, but it also is going to help with making sure the ecosystems there stay healthy while creating a livelihood for those persons that are doing that work. So this dual effect. Another example under the Bahama Reefs project of a pipeline project is the Reef Rescue Network. So the Perry Institute for Marine Science, along with some other partners, will actually be working with tourism operators and dive shops to train up their staff how to do coral restoration and even offer some type of diving that relates to coral restoration to clients that come in. So they'll be raising funding and also like creating an additional revenue stream for these businesses, but the work that they'll be doing will also help with coral reef restoration. And there are a number of other projects that are about 7 projects currently in the pipeline, and we are actually speaking with stakeholders and seeking out additional projects, business ideas, startups, etc., who would be interested in accessing this funding. And on that note, one of those that I'm pretty proud of is we are working with the Small Business Accelerator. It's a entity that was established by the government of the Bahamas to support small and medium enterprises. So there'll be like a blue economy accelerator that's going to be giving funding to those startup businesses through that partnership. So this is a mechanism that supports livelihood, is generating funding, but is also good for the reefs, which help with flood risk reduction. Then the other 2 I would like to mention before I shut up, Bradley, is the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund. So in addition to supporting the Bahamas and the region with creating a protected areas network, the cry is we need funding. You have to have money to manage these. And so the Nature Conservancy helped to set up in the region an architecture of national conservation trust funds. In the Bahamas, ours is called the Bahamas Protected Areas Fund, and our director is in the back there waving, Karen Panton. And so this trust fund would have received an initial endowment of $2.5 million from the Government of the Bahamas and the Global Environment Facility, plus $5 million through its parent, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund from TNC that is earmarked for the Bahamas. So through that endowment, they have been able to generate interest on that, and so far BPAF has been able to grant out over $1 million to partners on the ground that's supporting climate change adaptation and restoration activities. And so these are the kinds of innovative, sustainable finance mechanisms that we are helping countries to deploy in the Bahamas, but also across the Caribbean region. And I'll save the other 2 for later in the conversation.
My question is, when do you sleep? Because that's a lot of work.
Like I said, it takes the village.
There we go, and nobody can be left behind. I also like how you touch on our connections with the Caribbean, and it's going to take all of us to make this happen. While you were talking, I was thinking about a conversation we had, and you described what adaptation funding is, and how you think about adaptation funding. Would you just touch on that for 1 second, please? You were saying something about a house and a foundation, just real fast.
Okay, so we were having the side conversation, and what I described was that we have our houses, and there's a foundation there, right? And there's a cost associated with the foundation, the walls. We have the foundation laid. And so this is like what I consider in my non-financial mind, the baseline. And we have our expenditure and our costs associated with getting that foundation laid. But then we also need to add on to that, right? In order for you to have a complete house, you have to put up the walls, you have to put in the windows, you have to put in the doors. And so our government has its regular budget, like Mr. Fitzgerald was just saying, and I liken that to the foundation. We know what that costs. We were operating in that way. We were good. But now we have these additional costs that are coming into the pot. We have to build, and we have to keep rebuilding and rebuilding because the walls and the roof keep getting destroyed. And so the difference between the regular costs that we had for the foundation and this continuous rebuilding, the money we have to keep putting in, that additional cost is the adaptation cost. And so whatever we need to do to keep those activities rebuilding, to me, that's the adaptation, whatever we need to do to keep the house stable.
Thank you. I know that was impromptu, but I felt like the people needed to know, we asking for adaptation funding, but what is adaptation funding? So let's go to Ashanti, and let's hear her talk about, maybe give you 3 things that young people are doing in our country right now to address climate change. So 3 things that you see yourself or other people doing to address climate change and to adapt to our current situation.
Well, thank you for the question. So I like to look at it from I'll say an age bracket in terms of context. So with reference to what a lot of the younger portion of our generation is actually doing, is routed within programs tailored specifically to the eco schools. Now this is a sub-collection underneath the Foundation of Environmental Learning that is spearheaded by the National Coordinator, which is the entity denoted as BREEF, the Bahamas Reef Environmental Education Foundation. And what they generally do, they operate within, internationally there are about 72 countries that are within this fold. In the Bahamas, we have the pleasure of having 40 schools indoctorate into this program. 17, I believe, from the private school sectors and public school sectors, my apologies, and the remaining from the private schools. And what they actually do is look at ways in which they can collaboratively, as a school, find more innovative and corresponding ways to, within their individual school environments, find adaptation and mitigation projects or policies. And I feel as though, in terms of how they do it, is in itself an innovation that can be modeled into more schools. Apart from this, there exists the programs underneath the Bahamas National Trust. That would be the Discovery Club that Ms. Musgrove denoted too, as well as the Navigators Club in conjunction with the Eco Camp that they usually have each year. And these are initiatives that allow young people to be more present in the environment and actually appreciate and serve more as environmental stewards. And I feel as though that is the definite connect between education and exposure, because it's one thing to learn about these aspects, and it's another thing to actually have a baseline to connect it to. It makes it more tentative, and you get to appreciate it more as a young person, because it's one thing to have a teacher express and explain, but if there's nothing to refer to, there exists a gap, and that is something that I can personally attest to. With reference to seeing that you asked what I would have done personally in terms of involving myself continuously in the environmental space. Again, I keep referring to the international aspects because I do believe there's one thing with understanding and immersing oneself in the Bahamian aspect of it. But again, climate change is a global issue, it's a global aspect, and to look at it from just the parameters of the 700 islands and keys would do us a disservice in the long run. So I've been continuously trying to find ways in which to involve myself in more international spaces, particularly aligned with the UNFCCC in the forms of the Youth for Climate initiatives that they have every year. In conjunction with this, I've been trying to work more with ACE in terms of ways in which the principles and policies that are applied on an international scale can be modified and in a sense reinvented within the Bahamas. And that would have been hosted under the United Nations Development Project in Bonn this past, I believe it was October. And the reason I refer to these aspects is because it changes the way in which you think. And you often refer, Bradley, in terms to activating the youth at a young age and empowering and instilling with them the materials they need to actually be proactive people in this space. And I believe that is fervently important. In conjunction to this, I will always have a special love for Brief because they've given so much to me in terms of, I'd say, development. And the reason I refer back to them is predominantly referring to the Bahamas Environmental Steward Scholarship that they host in conjunction with the Island School. And from that program, I have grown tremendously. I have gotten to see in more detail the things that I can now make more sense of and apply more so to the environmental space. And in referring to individuals that have passed through the program, Trurenda Cox, Antonio Brown, Mr. Watson, it's so much that you can actually digest as you progress through. And we as young people are beginning now more than ever to understand that it's one thing to learn, it's another thing to be exposed and enlightened. And for us to make a difference in this space, that has to be a continual process that we can refer to.
I like how you mentioned Brief, and you say it's one thing to learn and it's another thing to be exposed and be enlightened. And you know what the next thing is? The next thing is to do. So also you mentioned the Bahamas National Trust, and that was very cool too, because when I was working with them, not only are we conserving species and spaces, but we did a project with ecotourism and helping people to find ways to make money out of the environment, to also, make it make more sense to them to conserve these areas. And Ms. Musgrove touched on that as well with the Bahama Reef Program and how you guys are investing in communities in this blue economy. Advisor Fitzgerald, the question for you is, and I know you touched on it a bit already, but what are the other innovative ways that government and private citizens can find ways to tie their work to helping the environment? What are the innovative financing mechanisms we have to harness to make these changes?
I want to say, first of all, that Ms. Shante Russell spoke about the involvement of the youth. And as a former Minister of Education, I have a great appreciation for the role that young people are playing. And talking about the exposure to the international organizations, the challenges we face as a country, not only from a social standpoint, yes, environmental, but also having a keen appreciation for the financial and commercial impact on our country as well. And so I want to commend her, particularly for the way she's representing the youth, not only of our country, but the youth worldwide. And they are playing a very active and aggressive role in this fight for climate change, climate justice, and so forth. So that's critical. Earlier today, we had a meeting and panel discussion with Partano, which is headed by Rick Fox, which has a very innovative approach with regard to construction. And one of the key things coming out of this whole dialogue, and the Prime Minister has been pushing this, is innovation. Not just sitting down and waiting and relying on others to come and address the challenges we face at home and in the region, and for small island development states around the world. But what are we going to do about it? Where's our ingenuity? Where is our ability to find solutions for adaptation and mitigation? And so just the fact that even during his contribution, day before yesterday, he invited all of those of goodwill who are looking for a home for solutions that are cutting edge, that are able to assist us and others around the world to find a home in the Bahamas if nobody else will accept and encourage you. And the Bahamas has gone so far as to enter into an MOU with Patana on the constructions of home on a pilot basis in order to encourage them to get started. And included in that is once that's done and we're satisfied, and based on the science that we've received so far, it looks as if this is something that is a real breakthrough. And then we will begin, as the Bahamas government, to purchase those by the thousands, okay, over the next couple of years. So the innovation is really critical. We have a lot of NGOs, you're talking about the TNC and others, who really have been involved in this fight for decades now. And they are coming to the table not only with solutions, but they are coming to the table with funding as well. And that is really, I talk about the $4 billion that we needed just for our NDCs. But that is what is needed. The Prime Minister had a discussion with the head of the IMF, Kristalina, on Sunday, just talking about ways that countries like ours can deal with the funding and the sustainability of our debt. Because when we calculate, Ms. Musgrove has asked me if we had done a calculation on the percentage of our debt that we can relate directly to climate change. And yes, we know that over the last 10 years or so, we know somewhere between 35 to 40% of our debt is directly associated to climate change. And it's not just loss and damage to property. We rely on tourism as our #1 industry. When a hurricane comes through, essentially our economy comes to a standstill until we're able to recover and rebuild. So it's not just the rebuilding, it's all the lost revenue that we have as a result of that, and the way we have to allocate funds in order to rebuild as well. So the debt sustainability is an issue for us because we're judged on what our debt to GDP is, but when you look at a big part of our debt, it's not for irresponsible management. It's not as if we're blowing the money away. It's not as if we're wasting it, but we have to borrow in order to rebuild over and over and over and over again. And then the international agencies come to us and say, you got to bring your debt down. And then now we have a hurricane passing through as we're speaking. And we don't know what that loss is going to be or what funds we're going to have to come up with over the next couple of months to rebuild. And the reality is, in small island development states, not everybody has insurance. Not everybody's house or businesses are insured. A lot of them are not insured. And so when they go, they're looking for the government to assist them with the rebuilding, apart from everything else, right? And so these are the real challenges. I know I went a bit off course, but I was just trying to bring it back to talk about the innovation is needed. We need as much help as we can from those who are well-intended, but at the end of the day, we still have to bear the brunt of a lot of it ourselves.
I think it's okay to go a little bit off topic in this topic because it's a pretty emotional situation. We're dealing with life or death. And I would say, the Partana conversation was phenomenal, and to see a Bahamian introducing in this innovation was fantastic. We had engineer Palacios was in there, and he was talking about how we got to just go out and do it. And I want to think about now, we're going to round out the questions, and we want to start with Ashanti. This is the last question. We're going to go real quickly with it so we can open up the floor. Everybody is impacted by climate change in some way, and therefore everybody has to be a part of that solution. Understanding that the government is managing our resources on our behalf, and knowing that we are responsible for what the end solution is, the end situation is, what can we do? So what are you going to tell future leaders to do to meet our adaptation needs?
Well, in order to bring the conversation full circle, we have to understand that it's not just a governmental issue. This is an issue that's going to require the minds, the capacities, the innovations of the governmental aspect, the NGOs, and the youth. And these three key areas are going to be very important to our development as we fight in this fight. And the reason I say that is because we're going to have the governmental backing, we're going to have the governmental support, we're going to have the continued expertise, understanding, and drive from the NGO capacity, and then we're going to have the youth, who are ultimately going to inherit the problem, who are going to be the stewards of tomorrow and are going to need to be as versed and understanding in the capacities and in the conversations that are going to be had. If any one of these entities are excluded from the debate or excluded from the conversation, ultimately our country will pay the price. It would be irresponsible of us at this point to put the entire load on the government. This is not a governmental issue. And at the same time, we cannot stray and put it all on the NGOs because they're going to need the tentative support of their government. And then there's the youth. Though very ambitious, we still need guidance. We still need that continued support, and we still need to understand that while we are innovative and while we have different ways of doing things, there may have been individuals that did what we did, but we could tweak it a bit, and it could work. So if we don't have that collaborative practice, ultimately, there will be challenges far greater than what we're currently experiencing.
Yeah, that's a reality that's kind of scary to face. And then, Ms. Musgrove, I know you gave us, a very good explanation of what TNC is doing, the Bahama Reefs program. You talked about mapping out, what our coastlines look like to facilitate adaptation, which is the first step, going from a 30-meter scale down to like a 4-meter scale. And that blew my mind just thinking about how much data you guys are processing. So if you could just give us like a quick synopsis of the TNC work again, and then, what's the next step for you as director of the Northern Bahamas program now?
All right, and so that synopsis really go back to providing technical support, and a lot of that is data. And yeah, that satellite data is really expensive, but we're able to leverage our brand internationally and to get these partnerships. And so, Bradley, what I want to say is that I think that one of the things we need to pay attention to, not just the Nature Conservancy, but across the various sectors, is more collaboration and more partnership. We can get so much more done if we work together. Two of the other things that I hadn't mentioned earlier is that the Nature Conservancy, because we're an international organization with a local program, we can take some risk. And we can put forward some innovation that maybe smaller entities on the ground can't. And so that's why we like to bring what we have to the table to collaborate with others. Across the region, we're looking at innovative mechanisms like blue bonds. Persons have heard about the Barbados blue bond deal, the one we did with Belize, and starting with Seychelles, and together, that's helped to relieve debt and unlock funding to the tune of more than a $250 million for these three countries. And so we're looking to work with additional countries who are interested to do this type of work. We're doing blue carbon feasibility studies for mangroves and seagrass across about 7 countries. And we also are looking at insurance for nature products based on a model that we did in Quintana Roo, Mexico, where the government and the stakeholders there were willing to redirect some funding from taxes to purchase insurance that would protect the reefs. And the year after they did that, a storm hit and was able to trigger almost $1 million to go back into repairing the reefs along that coastline. So these are some of the innovative mechanisms that we're looking at. I'm trying to deploy to help countries, to help stakeholders. And I think that even sometimes when there is a risk that and there's a chance that it might not work, We all fail or we all win together. And so more collaboration, more partnerships, taking some risk, going along that journey with those who are willing to go, I think is very important.
You know, not many people say the word taking risks with a smile on their face, so you must be fairly brave. So thank you for sharing that. And then we could finish with Advisor Fitzgerald, just to give a word about how we can all collaborate, like Ms. Musgrove is pointing out, to make this thing happen.
I commend the TNC not only for the role they play in the Bahamas, but in the region. And we are in discussions with the TNC as well as to how we can address some of these funding challenges we have. But it goes back to, you look at mitigation, adaptation, resilience. I mean, all of these things that we are speaking about, they require funding, right? And so we need, as they say, all hands on deck. We need all partners of goodwill, all those who are concerned about the future of the planet and of our country and others like ours to really step forward. And again, as the Prime Minister said, to act in your own self-interest, because if we don't address it, you will make us and our children, climate refugees. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you have condemned us, as was said in Hamlet, to a watery grave. So that is the reality for us. And so yes, we need all hands on deck. We can't give up. We have to keep fighting together to address these issues. And I think that with the innovation, with the support of the young people and the drive and commitment and their involvement in what we're doing, and with NGOs and those of goodwill, and the government with the mindset to take this challenge seriously and put whatever resources we can. And they're limited, but we are putting significant resources into it because it's a matter of life or death for us. So it's not as if we have a choice, but we just don't have sufficient to do everything that we need to do. And so we are very appreciative of all those who have lent a helping hand, who show interest. And in this fight, we're going to have to continue to fight this together.
Together, that's the number one word I heard today. From you, from Ms. Musgrove, from Ashanti. We're talking about TNC working with governments, not just in the Bahamas, but working around the region. Ashanti is asking for the elder generations to cooperate with young people, and your government is asking for everybody in our country to lean into this problem, and I think that's a message that resounds. We have a couple minutes for a question. First hand I saw, I'm sorry I don't have a mic for you, but if you project, we'll be okay.
Hello, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I come from the small island of St. Martin. We were hit devastatingly by Hurricane Irma in 2015, and I lost my childhood memories, and I was in Boston at the time studying. Didn't know if my mom, my dad, my grandparents, my sister, if they were okay. I wasn't able to get in contact with them for 4 days. So needless to say, this situation hits home. I've left my country in the pursuit of preserving our nation through studying climate economics. And my dream was always to come back home and give back. And unfortunately, my country's delegation could not be here today, but I found a way to come here, and I was welcomed with open arms by the Bahamian delegation. So thank you, number one. Number two, my question is, even though St. Martin was hit so devastatingly by Hurricane Irma, which was a wake-up call for the Caribbean, we are half French and half Dutch, so we cannot apply for these funds through the different financial structures you mentioned. However, we still have not internally prioritized climate change in the way that Bahama has. right? We have priorities that are fixed on the olden ways of developing our economies, which was built on the back of tourism. So my question, I think, is mainly for Mr. Fitzgerald, is how did the government switch their mindset from the old ways of tourist development, which is allowing foreign direct investments to build hotels and allowing no zoning laws, building by the coastlines. How did that shift change to then prioritize the blue economy? And, once you have that mindset, then you will look for the infrastructure, the finance, the collaborations with these organizations. So can you give a little bit of background on that? Because I think St. Martin is stuck.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, I think it goes back, well, in the Bahamas, we have, I think, a unique situation as well because hurricanes do pass through the Caribbean, but at the end of the day, the Bahamas seems to be the islands that get hit the most. And so our reality is a bit different. So I think that helps to kind of integrate itself into the mindset of leadership. And so even before this prime minister came into office, and he's only been in office for a year, prior to that, we had a lot of discussions on how we were going to retool our economy, how we were going to look at reorganizing our financial structure, and what we were going to do in order to prepare our country for the future.
Wow.
And that revolved around the environment. I attended a conference in the British Virgin Islands late last year when I made the comment to those who assembled there. They were all scientists. And I told them that as a boatsman and avid fisherman, someone who loves the water and grew up on the water, although I have businesses and so forth, so there is an entrepreneurial side, that I was very encouraged that, to me, this was the first time that I saw where the environment and the economy, as we know it, the financial structure of governments, could be on the same page. Because at the end of the day, it was in everyone's financial as well as social interest to protect the environment. And so that's really where we started from our mindset, right? Because we didn't now have this tug-of-war between protecting the environment and ensuring that our economy grew, which is normally where the crossroad happens for governments and for leaders. Yes, the environment is important, but we got to find jobs.
Yeah.
People got to eat.
Yeah.
Right? We need foreign direct investment coming in to boost up our reserves in our economy. And so they were at odds.
Yeah.
That's changed. And I think we made that switch early.
Yes.
We appreciated that early, that the environment and the scientists and government could be on the same page and build a stronger economy, reorganize our finances, and prepare our country better for the future. And so that was our thinking, and that's the Prime Minister's thinking, and that's what's driven us to the point, and that's why we have come so far in such a short space of time. Although it's only been 12 months, we have legislation in place for carbon credits, and we're developing a financial market around that. So it was a thought that, kind of drove our policies and our what we want to do as a government coming in. And the Prime Minister has been driving it from day one, from his first speech at the UN when he came into office.
My fear is I hope we don't need another hurricane to have that good governance, but I will keep pushing. So thank you for your,
Yes.
And I guess I could add on to that question and talk about just what TNC and other organizations have done to move the Bahamas to this place where the government is ready and receptive and conscious of the value of the environment. This was something that happened as a cooperation between government and nonprofits and young people. So tell us about some of the things CNC did to put us in this place, by educating individuals and, setting the table kind of.
Well, the Nature Conservancy is certainly one of a number of NGOs that has been for the last several decades and more, even as old as like the Bahamas National Trust, that's at least 60 years old, just continuing to educate and bring awareness about these issues. And a part of that has also been working with the Ministry of Education to get climate change and other environmental topics integrated into the school curriculum. And so when I was growing up, I learned about mountains and rivers and fjords and things that didn't exist in the country. And now when you look at the school curriculum, it looks a lot different and it represents what's around us. So even initiatives like that, and the Nature Conservancy is also poured into capacity building and support for young professionals in the field, and also supporting those other NGOs that do the education and awareness, so that I think that work over the decades, coupled with the increased awareness through technology, social media, the things that the recurrent hurricanes has made everybody pay more attention. And now I feel like we have this critical mass of persons in country who are willing to push the needle forward.
Fantastic. I hear a history of collaboration. We have one last question. This gentleman had his hand up first. Sorry. Okie dokie, thank you.
I think it is people like them who encourage young people in leading it. But thank you so much for that. Before moving into my quick question on climate, first of all, Mr. Jerome, I think what you really said on ecology and economy coming together, that is so important and so crucial. If ecology and economy doesn't come, I think it's real challenge for all of us. So thank you so much for highlighting that and for looking forward to the young representatives sitting out there for collaborations. It is young leaders like you which will really engage young people like us across the sectors, across the world, making sure that there is an intergenerational partnerships coming together. Now, I represent a movement called Youth for Green Hydrogen, which we launched back 7 months back. And in over 7 months of time, we have mobilized young people from 78 countries talking about climate solutions. Of course, campaigning for net zero is good, but campaigning for net zero with solutions is even better. So in the same line, when we are following this very closely with the government of Bahamas, it was so interesting that in the last couple of months back, His Excellency Philip Davis, the Honorable Prime Minister, announced for a $14 million on 25 megawatt production of the solar batteries in the country. Now, in the same lines, Jerome, over to you. How do you think that the government or maybe Bahamas in general are coming together in skilling young people in making sure that they're prepared for these green jobs? Because one crucial challenge that we also realize as we mobilize is that green skilling is important for green jobs. And I was speaking earlier with the co-founder of LinkedIn, where we are working together in creating a virtual skill center on green hydrogen. Is that only 1% of people in the world are deployed with green skills for green jobs? So, I mean, is there any way out that the government in Bahamas is looking forward? So this is a mobilization report that we launched, and of course, I'll present it to you later. But over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I would have stated earlier that I was a former Minister of Education, and so preparing our citizens for the opportunities and jobs in the future really is a priority. But from day one, we have engaged our university, which is the University of the Bahamas. We've engaged our technical school, which is the Bahamas Techno-Vocational Institute. We have engaged our group that's called BAMSI, which deals with the environment and agriculture as well. So we have taken an active role in looking at where the opportunities and jobs will be in environmental, even with regard to data collection. We know that data collection is going to be a big issue when you talking about the environment and you're applying for grants and research and so forth. And so from that area as well, we're talking and in the process now setting up a program through BTVI where we will be looking at training young people for opportunities that exist not only in the Bahamas but also throughout the region. So we're very, very engaged in it. As we look at the various things that we need to do, we're looking at how can young people be engaged, and also how do we change our curriculum, how do we engage our institutions educationally wise to be at the forefront of preparing our young people for that. So it's a good point you raised, and it's something that we're very cognizant of and pushing as well. We've been very, very proactive, and going back to the previous question, so much so that when the Prime Minister came into office, he set up a special unit within the Office of the Prime Minister, which focuses solely on areas that are important for us in environmental and economics around the environment, which I head up. And that's helped us, again, to move extremely fast in the implementation of our agenda and the Prime Minister's agenda.
Fantastic. Thank you for those thoughtful answers. We're going to wrap up right now with just a maybe even 30-second plug from each member of the panel, beginning with Ms. Russell. Just tell us the thing that you want us to remember when we leave this room, please.
I'd say the thing that I want you to take with you when you leave this room would be, as it is echoed and has been echoed throughout many of the halls in this platform, we are ready to take on the fight. We are ready to be engaged. We are asking you to entrust us the way we are trusting you. We want to play a more integral part in all capacities and in all spaces. And we're willing to do what is necessary to listen, to learn, to understand, to be enlightened, and to receive exposure in all capacities at this point. Because we are fully understanding that for us to be able to play a more integral part as things progress forward, we need to understand now we are past the point of acknowledging the problem. We are past the point of talking more tentatively about the problem. We have spoken about it for years. And it is a conversation that is drawn out. It's a conversation that has literally come to a point to which I will use the expression, we are continuously beating the proverbial horse. We need to apply action to this problem. We are ready to be activated. We want to be actionable, and we're looking forward to working more closely with governments and NGOs in the near future.
Action now. That's what I hear you saying. Thank you. Ms. Musgrove, please give us some thoughts, please.
Yes, so just in closing, we have a team of about 11 Bahamians at the Nature Conservancy that work at our Bahamas program or that work regionally or one of our global teams. And the Bahamas is home for us, so this is personal. And so TNC, we are committed to continuing to seek and implement creative and innovative solutions to our climate adaptation issues in country, together with the government, the youth, and other partners. And so we're looking for tangible, lasting results that are going to get to these issues. And I will add to the call of the country in saying, if you have goodwill, if you have some dollars, come bring it to us.
There we go, there we go. I feel like TNC is the perfect partner for you to try to move things forward when it comes to making that first step, and then we have to take the rest of the movements on. Would you please finish us off, Mr. Fitzgerald?
I just want to say, don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. We have to continue to work together to resolve the challenges that we face. So don't give up.
Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience. I hope you all have a great evening.